Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lars Schall, and I am now connected in Big Bad Los Angeles with Nomi Prins, the author of the book All the President's Bankers. Hello, Nomi.
Hello, Lars. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. Well, let's talk about your new book. What was the motivation to write the book, and what's the main idea behind it?
The motivation actually stemmed from a novel I had written before this book, which was called Black Tuesday, where I talked about the historical fiction of the 1929 crash. And in order to do the research for that book, which wasn't substantive as the research I wound up doing for All the President's Bankers, I discovered this meeting that took place in the rooms of the Morgan Bank at 23 Wall Street, which is just a really quick little walk from the back of the New York Stock Exchange on October 24th, 1929, which was when the stock market was beginning its initial descent, which it sort of bumped up and down a few times and ultimately lost 90% or so of its value over the next few years. But on this day, there were six bankers, the big six bankers of the time, that convened at the House of Morgan under the request of a man named Tom Lamont, who was the acting chairman of Morgan. Jack Morgan, the actual chairman, was over in Europe traveling when all of this was happening. And he called the five main bankers of the city to come, and they had a 20-minute meeting in his rooms. And they decided after 20 minutes they would each put in $25 million to save the stock markets, because they all sat in that room and had these secrets that they were hiding, aside from the fact that the market was spindling out of control. One of the men in that room was Al Wiggin. He was the head of Chase. He was shorting Chase shares while he was talking about buying them to save the markets. Charles Mitchell was another fellow in that room who ran National City Bank, which is now part of Citigroup. He was in there because he had this deal that he wanted, this biggest merger of the time that was going to go through if he could keep his shares up, because the deal was going to occur with his shares. And so everybody had other reasons to save the markets besides, helping the general population from spill out or the economic fallout of the problem. And in 20 minutes they decided to do this. And that whole meeting and just the drama of the scene and the way in which these big six gathered together and decided, and the way that they were supported by President Herbert Hoover, and that after their decision they were touted in the press and the New York Times and so forth as having saved the markets again, and there was just so much congratulation, and just all of that scene really stuck with me. And so for the book All the President's Bankers, I really thought of this idea of the big six, because today we have big six banks. And before the crash of 1929, it was also six banks in the U.S. that really controlled not just the financial markets, not just wealth, not just power from that perspective, but there was a political financial line that really was drawn around bankers and presidents during that time, today, before that. And I started looking at examining through the president's perspective just which bankers they had relationships with, that they trusted to fix the country, that they hung out with socially, that they went yachting with, that they were in clubs with, that they went to Ivy League universities with, and so forth. And that's really how I started to shape the idea, the research for this book, which took me to all the presidents' archives around the country, from Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president during the Panic of 1907, which is where I start the book, through Barack Obama, who doesn't have an archive yet because he's still in office, but all the documents in between.
You've mentioned 1907, and the most dominant banker back then was John Pierpont Morgan. Was he basically the representative of the City of London and British banking on Wall Street?
He was the one who had the closest ties, both from a personal standpoint and from the fact that the Morgan Bank had ties with the City of London as well as Paris. At the time, they had companies that they were associated with that had their name on both of those cities. And they had also, the background to the panic of 1907, which was a huge bank panic in the United States, where people, particularly in New York, were rushing the banks to get their deposit out because there was a confidence problem and there was a banking crisis, and Teddy Roosevelt was scared that it would spill into a larger economic crisis for the country, and he called upon J.P. Morgan to, again, fix the situation. This was in 1907, 22 years before the crash in 1929, where his bank was also at the center. So he certainly represented international interest with respect to the U.S. financiers. He was the most powerful, most international of the U.S. financiers, but he was also very deeply concerned with his growth in the United States at the time. After that point, there was much more growth after World War I and World War II of the Morgan Bank back into Europe, but the initial ties had happened then. And even before the panic in 1907, in the 1890s, it was the Morgan family, and this is one of the other large themes of my book, which is that there aren't just individuals controlling the political, financial alliances and policies of the U.S. and therefore globally from the U.S., but these are families that have been in power for decades, for over a century, whose legacies continue to maintain that influence and that power. And the Morgan family was certainly one of the main families that did that. So even in the 1890s, one of the Morgans, Junius Morgan, had helped save the City of London when the Bank of England couldn't do it, and raised a lot of private money to save one of the banks that had been failing in London. So this idea of the sort of private banker saving other private bankers, both internationally as well as domestically, was born a little bit before my book, but certainly continued into the century of the 20th century.
If I ask you, related to the panic of 1907, cui bono, what would be your answer?
The real benefactor of the panic of 1907 was J.P. Morgan, of course, who ran the Morgan Bank at the time and was the key influencer and confidant, really, of the President Teddy Roosevelt, who gave him the power and the decision-making ability, backed by the White House and the Treasury Department, to decide which banks would live and which banks would die in the wake of the bank panic in 1907, which is what Morgan did. And what he did was choose to have kind of to subsidize the banks that were related to him in some manner, whether they were run by his friends or associates or relationships, or that he had just financial interest in. And so after the panic in 1907, it was really the Morgan interests, the Stillman interests, who were running National City Bank, the Bakers, who were running First National City Bank, and those two banks ultimately became what we know today as Citigroup, which is one of the big six banks. And of course, Morgan still exists today in the form of J.P. Morgan Chase, which is one of the big six banks. So the benefit was really to Morgan, and also it helped to make him confident as well to steer the ship for the establishment of what became the Federal Reserve, and to be an active participant in getting that to happen. And that, of course, became the bank for the big banks.
How was the panic of 1907 used by Morgan and Rockefeller interests to create the Federal Reserve?
That's a very interesting question. And what happened was, even before the panic, the idea of these financiers, the new power elite in America, was that they were finding a way to push what I call the age of financial capitalism. They didn't call it that, but the idea that you could make money now out of money, as opposed to just having it be connected to industrial interests like steel and oil. And although the Rockefellers had made a substantial amount of money and would continue to do so with the Standard Oil Company and other interests, they, particularly William Rockefeller, was looking for a way to get into this idea of making money for the sake of making money and becoming one of the money trusts, because that was where not just the wealth, I mean, they had a lot of wealth, these families already, but where the power lied. And after the panic of 1907, particularly J.P. Morgan, and to a lesser extent Rockefeller was not involved in the actual meeting that took place at Jekyll Island, although William Rockefeller did have a membership at the Jekyll Island Club at the time. He was not involved in a meeting that took place in 1910, which a lot of people know about, but to bang out some of the actual blueprints for the Federal Reserve. And the fellow that went from the United States government was Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was a Rhode Island senator, and also very connected to the banking community. He knew Morgan, he knew the Rockefellers and so forth, and he and one of the assistant treasury secretaries met with four bankers, Frank Vanderlip, Herr Davidson, Paul Warburg, and another banker, to basically all of whom were connected to, and Benjamin Strong, sorry, all of whom were connected to the Morgan interest. And it was J.P. Morgan's membership that I talk about in the book that allowed them to even meet at Jekyll Island. It was a very exclusive club at the time. You needed to be a member. None of these people were members, and J.P. Morgan wasn't at the meeting that took place. In fact, and this is sort of where the Rockefeller contingent comes in on the outside of that, Nelson Aldrich wasn't even planning on going or asking about going to Jekyll Island at that time. He wanted to have these meetings in his Rhode Island estate, you know, to still get away from the public, but also to be in his own estate, which was north of New York and certainly north of Georgia, which is where Jekyll Island is. But he wound up getting hit by a trolley car in Manhattan, in New York City, while he was visiting there to talk to Morgan and some other people about this whole idea. And so he was actually convalescing. He wasn't sure he was going to go anywhere, and that was when J.P. Morgan was like, you know, go to this area, you know, they'll take care of you, etc., and just get this done, and sort of gave them the invitation, and a lot of arrangements were made on Jekyll Island to have these people even come, because it was still November. It wasn't on season yet. Jekyll Island in general as a club started becoming into season in December and January, when all the rich families would come down for the holidays, and all the rich men would talk, and the rich ladies and children would sort of hang out and play. And so all of that really happened because J.P. Morgan in particular, and also Nelson Aldrich, whose son, Winthrop Aldrich, became a head of Chase Bank for 2 decades, and his great nephew David Rockefeller became also the head of Chase for 2 decades, and his other great nephew Nelson Rockefeller became the 4-time governor of New York City. So there was a line that started from the Federal Reserve period through very recently as well. And the interests were really to save the bankers. The interests were to make sure that in a panic situation, again, there would be a Federal Reserve that would back the banks, so that there would not be a greater crisis on them, and they wouldn't have to put up their own money or scrounge around to figure out how to save themselves or to save their system. And that was really the impetus for the Fed, to have a consolidated entity that could create currency that could back them in times of panic. And from the American government perspective, from William Taft, who was the president after Teddy Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson, who was the president after him, they both believed that a Federal Reserve was required to basically, and this is not what's discussed in history so much, but it's in my book, to promote American power into the new century. That the idea of having a competitive central bank that was aligned with the private banks was something that was very important to these presidents as well, of both parties, both of whom had very strong personal connections to the Morgans, to the Aldriches, and to the Rockefellers, and to other families that were operating the money trusts at the time.
Was the creation of the Fed a conspiracy?
Excuse me? It's not a conspiracy that Wall Street is behind the Fed. These were real people from real Wall Street who had a real meeting, who not only did they have a meeting about the Federal Reserve, they were working with Nelson Aldrich, who was the head of the Senate Finance Committee, for 2 years, gathering data together and traveling in Europe to determine how the makeup of the banks in England and in France in particular could be rejiggered to be used for the blueprints for the Federal Reserve. James Stillman, who was one of the money trust leaders and a friend of Morgan and a friend of Rockefeller, and running National City Bank, which was one of the largest banks in the country at the time, still is under Citigroup now today, traveled for months with Nelson Aldrich in Europe for 2 years, for months out of those 2 years before the Jekyll Island meeting. So it's not a conspiracy. This is really documented fact. The fact that there were 4 bankers and 2 people from Washington at the Jekyll Island meeting itself is also not a conspiracy. It is fact. Also a fact is that after that meeting, because as I mentioned, Nelson Aldrich had been hit by this trolley car, and he was still not in the best of health after the Jekyll Island meeting. He was supposed to present the report out of that that meeting to Washington, and he was too ill to make it. So instead of he presenting that report internally into Washington, it was presented by two bankers. It was presented by Frank Vanderlip, who was the number 2 guy, who worked for James Stillman, number 2 guy at National City Bank, as well as Henry Davison, who was a senior partner at the Morgan Bank. And so this is, again, and it is not a conspiracy. This is just what happened.
Yeah, but did those people at the meeting at Jekyll Island conspired with each other to get the Federal Reserve created?
There was nothing to conspire about. I mean, the thing is that, yes, they worked together to create the Federal Reserve because they wanted it, because Washington wanted it. So the leaders of Wall Street and the leaders of Washington all were on the same page. So there was no need for anything conspiratorial. They collaborated.
Yeah, but the public wasn't allowed to know this, right? And they were very careful that the public didn't found out about it.
Absolutely. They were, but I think when the term conspiracy gets batted around, it has this almost context like, did this happen this way? Did this not happen this way? Are they trying to get together to take something away from the public? No, they're not. They were just trying to protect their interests. And the reason the public wasn't involved is they just think the public needed to be involved politically in any manner that would get in the way of them designing the Fed. And so what I have had in the book is there's a lot of conversations that took place under the Taft administration, in the 1910 period, and then towards 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was actually passed and signed upon in December 1913, but the later years under the Woodrow Wilson administration is many conversations happening in Washington, as they do today, where senators and bankers and presidents make conversations, meet up, have midnight meetings, decide how structures should be implemented and what's going to get signed, and then how it's going to get spun to the public. So if you think of that as a conspiracy, all of government's a conspiracy, but the reality is this is how these men operated. They didn't even really consider they didn't consider that this would fail. The idea was merely how it would succeed and in what format. And when after the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Woodrow Wilson, he said to the public, yes, he sold it to the public as this is a reserve bank that will help provide credit to the general public, to small farmers, to small banks. It will help America in general because it will be there to provide liquidity to the system when there are negative financial crises or whatever going on. That is how he sold it. But the reality is that from its beginning, the Fed was fashioned to protect the largest, which also happened to be the most powerful politically, socially, and personally connected institutions in the United States. And that's how it has continued to operate. That's why it's preserved all the mergers that have happened over the century since. That's why it's provided liquidity at a benefit towards the largest banks. And that's why today the big 6 banks are larger. They're not all the same 6 banks as back then, but they're largely derivations of them, and they're larger than they've ever been before. And they have more Federal Reserve subsidies than they've ever had before. And the Federal Reserve has a larger book than it's ever had before. So all of this has culminated over a century. Some of it's been open in that we see the results. The meetings that take place that created it and so forth, the public was not invited to, nor was the public invited to the White House meetings with Woodrow Wilson or Taft to discuss it. That is true.
Does the U.S. need the Fed?
The U.S. banking system definitely needs the Fed because without its subsidies, it would have probably failed many times over the years, certainly over the recent years. But again, it's really important to note, and this is one of the main themes of the book, that U.S. political leaders have believed from the beginning of the Fed that they need the Fed. So the Fed is as much a bank for the banks as it's a political instrument of financial power for the government. And so they believe, the government believes it needs the Fed. And from the standpoint of the actions of the Fed to subsidize and to save the largest institutions that are integrated in so many different ways with the government as well. They deal with the public, we give them our deposits, taxpayers subsidize their failures and their bailouts. But at the same time, the philosophies of the political and financial elite members of America are aligned behind the Fed. So do we need the Fed? The public doesn't need the Fed. The activities that the Fed provides that relate to the public, such as maneuvering interest rates or so forth, could be done by the Treasury Department, although the Treasury Department is equally subsidizing and has politically, personally, socially, and financially the banking institutions as well. So, it's a question of, do we need something to maintain rates? Yeah, it's useful to have one entity to maintain rates, but that's not really what the Fed does as its full job. What it does and what it has done is subsidize a faulty banking system in the disguise of regulating that banking system and of protecting the credit, the overall credit availability to the country, over which it really has had no power. That was just kind of one of the lies under which it was created back 100 years ago.
And hasn't the Fed become an international bailout bank?
Well, yes. Well, of course, it has because the whole globalization of finance has in different ways over the past century. The American banks aren't the only banks that are at risk. The large American banks for economic crises. These crises are global. They're increasingly global, and they will be increasingly global in the future. And so when the Fed has to protect the American banks, it has to protect their largest counterparties. And those largest counterparties, by nature of the globalized structure of finance, include European banks. They can include Asian banks. They basically include the major counterparties of the big six banks. But not only that, the policies of the Fed themselves, aside from the subsidies, but the idea of subsidizing, the philosophy behind it of the Fed has moved, as we've seen over the last few years, into Europe. So now you have an effectively, very close to zero interest rate policy going throughout Europe, and subsidizing and bailing out and finding ways to fortify the larger institutions at the expense of the smaller institutions, and fortify the larger countries at the expense of the smaller countries as an institutionalized policy that the Fed is promoting. So is the Treasury Department of the United States, so is the government of the United States. This is a collaborative promotion that has become global as well.
Because it's 100 years now since the outbreak of World War I, what has to be said about big banking on Wall Street and the slaughter that went on in Europe?
Again, it ties back to the Morgan Bank and the Morgan family. When Woodrow Wilson was contemplating not involving the U.S. in the war originally, he had a meeting at the White House. And it was a very interesting meeting because he had campaigned on a platform of being separate from the big banking interests, which were called the money trusts at the time. But he was really friends with the Morgans. They had supported him, the family had supported him before he became president and into his presidency as well. And the meeting that he had in it was July of 1914 at the White House, was very criticized by the press in a lot of ways, because it was odd to them that Morgan was visiting the White House after this kind of campaign against the banking interests. But it turned out that Morgan was talking to Wilson about financing war. And in fact, when the war started, and the United States immediately was financing the French and the British, it was because of the capabilities and the push of the Morgan Bank to do that. And through the course of the war, the Morgan Bank financed or directed the financing of 75% of all the private monies and investments that went into the U.S. war effort and to the allies of the U.S. And so there was a very strong collaboration at that point between the Morgan Bank organizing the other banks and Woodrow Wilson into the war. So they're very directly related, because without money, countries don't tend to be able to go to war.
Was the Treaty of Versailles beneficial to big banking on Wall Street?
What happened in the Treaty of Versailles, and there was a Morgan partner who was active with Woodrow Wilson when the treaty was being negotiated and signed, a man named Tom Lamont, who was involved in the Morgan Bank for decades before and after, one decade before, many decades after. He was instrumental in negotiating reparations and how they would become part of the Treaty of Versailles. And the reason for that was that it was important for the banks, the big banks in particular, to have some sort of stability in Europe so that they could basically get involved in investments in rebuilding infrastructure in Europe. And they were building infrastructure, they were financing infrastructures on all sides of the participants in the World War, and they benefited from that because they were able to expand their reach and their business into Europe in a way they would not have been able to do before the war. So the treaty itself and the end of the war was very helpful. Now, of course, the treaty ultimately wasn't helpful enough because we did have a second war after that, after a great crash and a Great Depression, through which the bankers continued to push the U.S. government to help fund some of the countries that they were doing private financing with in order so that they could continue to do private financing. So there was a series of agreements after the Treaty of Versailles that the bankers were involved in because the Treaty of Versailles wasn't really working well enough, where they were still able to push for U.S. government financing of certain restructuring in Europe so that they could piggy bank upon that and, again, increase their own financial reach into Europe.
Was the Federal Reserve a crucial factor in creating the Great Crash of 1929?
It wasn't as great a factor as the fact that, because it wasn't really pushing as much money or cheap money into Wall Street as it does today. It was a factor, definitely. In fact, one of the members, New York Federal Reserve Class A, it was called Director Charles Mitchell, was also the chairman of National City Bank. And while the markets were starting to falter really into the early part of 1929, he was the one that was pushing the whole Fed to reduce interest rates and to sort of allow more cheaper money and liquidity into the system, because he knew from his own books, from the bank's books, from what his business dealings were, that things were deeply problematic. So in a way, it might have exacerbated the intensity of the crash, but it was really the maneuvers of the largest banks that were getting involved in all sorts of speculation after World War I, because the three presidents that were involved in running the United States after World War I, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, had a very hands-off policy to the types of speculation that these bankers could engage in, and they definitely engaged in a lot, as well as the Treasury Secretary at the time, Andrew Mellon, was himself a crook. He was a millionaire. He was an industrialist. He ran a bank as well. And he was also ultimately left in disgrace from the Hoover administration because of allegations of all sorts of various types of tax evasion and using the tax policies he was creating to help himself in this whole bubble of speculation. So really everyone was involved.
Did the policies of the Fed do any good during the Great Depression?
Again, not really. The main policy that helped during the Great Depression was the GlassSteagall Act and the confidence that it instilled with the U.S. population in the banking system, because that act separated these speculative activities from depositors' money, as well as the potential for people in the country, for taxpayers, to have to shoulder additional risks with respect to what the banking industry was doing. So the Federal Reserve today talks about the Federal Reserve back then as being involved in leading up and as well as potentially helping in the Great Depression. But the reality is it wasn't really as evolved as it's become today. It wasn't quite a mature enough Fed, and so a lot of what was going on had to come from legislation, it had to come from leadership, and had to come also from the ground up. And one bank leader in particular, the chairman of Chase under FDR, whose name was Winthrop Aldrich, was a friend of FDR's and worked with FDR to push and promote and endorse the GlassSteagall Act, because he believed, even as a banker, it was important for the nation and for confidence in banking in general to have a more safe and stable system.
Why had there been a power shift from Morgan to Rockefeller taking place during and after World War II?
One of the things that happened, as I mentioned that before, that the Morgan Bank had been the preeminent financer, 75% of private financing, as I said before, into World War I, very closely connected to Woodrow Wilson, to the Treasury Secretary at the time, very involved in the decisions that Washington was making on financing the bond move, the war bond effort throughout the United States to raise additional funds and so forth. But by the time World War II came along, and mostly because of this fellow Winthrop Aldrich that I had just mentioned before, who was the chairman of Chase and friends with FDR, there was a shift to financing the war from the Morgan Bank, which traditionally only worked with big financings of corporations and big investors in countries, to this idea that individuals would be participants in financing the war. And so the Liberty Bond effort, which was the war bond effort for World War II that went through the United States, really was led by Chase chairman Winthrop Aldrich, as well as National City Bank, the other big bank chairman, James Perkins, and after he died, a couple of other chairmen in there, a man named Randolph Burgess, who had been a New York Fed director and then became a senior vice president at National City Bank at the time, who had a very close relationship with FDR's Treasury Secretary, Morgenthau. So it became about relationships, and the stronger relationships with the FDR administration and the Truman administration and the Eisenhower administration started to tilt towards these other banks and bankers, Chase and National City. And also those banks had a different model than the Morgan Bank, which is they used individual people's money in the war drive, and they would ask people to open checking accounts accounts with them, and also to buy war bonds from them at the same time. So throughout the war, they were gaining customers, which also helped their strength because it gave them more capital for the future, as well as being intricately involved with Washington and the war bond effort, as well as private financing efforts. And so the balance tilted on from a very relationship-driven, and as well as a philosophy of getting individuals on the ground to participate more ideology.
Yeah. How did financial power shape the world order after World War II?
So after World War II, when Truman was president and the World Bank had just been created through the Bretton Woods agreements and the IMF and so forth, there was a man named John McCloy who had been the Assistant Secretary of War under FDR, who had also been a private lawyer and worked very closely with the Rockefeller family, with Nelson Rockefeller and later David Rockefeller. But at the time, after the World War II, he was asked to become the second president of the World Bank when the World Bank had just been created. And when he accepted that position, he did it with one stipulation, that Wall Street would be the engine that distributed bonds that funded a lot of World Bank initiatives. So he requested something outside of legislation because of conversations he had with the Treasury Secretary of Truman, that Wall Street would be really the decider of what countries the World Bank would support. And these countries were capitalist countries, and into the Cold War, the capitalist countries got better deals. When the Cold War was going forward, the Eisenhower administration after that would fund still the countries that were most aligned with the ideals of John McCloy, who then became the chairman of Chase later on, as well as other bankers of the time. So a lot of what happened militarily as well as financially in terms of America's expansion after World War II and through the Cold War was this alignment of financiers having military backing from the United States and ideological backing, and the United States government wanting the bankers to expand branches into the countries in which they had foothold as well. So there was this mutual alignment, and both were growing their superpower status, politically and financially after the war. And the entities of the World Bank and IMF were just components in that growth.
One part of the Bretton Woods system was that the US dollar was almost as good as gold. And why did so many prominent US bankers advocate ending the gold standard in the late 1960s, early 1970s? Could it be that the gold standard serves as an effective check on the growth of excessive financial sector growth and abusive banking practices?
Oh, it absolutely does, because what gold or having an asset, which was gold back speculation, restrain. Gold was effectively a regulation in a way. I mean, it did restrain bankers' expansion because they had to have a certain reserve amount set aside, and it was a real amount, and it was an asset that other world participants were involved in as well, and so they had less control of raids on gold or movement of gold and so forth. Whereas once they got the U.S. to get off of a gold standard and get off of this requirement that gold-backed transactions or speculations or expansions of the major financial institutions, they then had access to a whole new level of expansion, and that's why today they much prefer having zero interest money, cheap money, to money that you have to pay interest on. It's really part of the same pattern of getting off the gold standard, which is the less constraint you have to speculation, the more you will speculate. And from the standpoint of a big bank, the more you will be able to speculate and expand your reach globally, which is what happened. There was a tremendous expansion globally of the U.S. banking interest, which had already started, as I talked about after the wars, but even more so after the gold standard was eliminated because it was just easier. There was just less chains to the bankers. So they had advocated very publicly that the gold standard be removed. And in fact, when Nixon finally announced it in '71, he didn't come up with the idea himself. This was something that Walter Wriston, who was a senior, became chairman of National City Bank, and David Rockefeller, who became chairman of Chase, had advocated very, very strongly in letters and correspondence and other types of personal conversations that I talk about in my book.
Yeah. Do you think that gold will have a future in the monetary system?
I think there's certainly a groundswell of people who want that, and countries outside of the U.S. who recognize that because of how the financial system has evolved globally, the U.S. banks in particular have so much power politically and financially. Politically because of their alliance with the U.S. government, and financially because of how much they leverage cheap capital without reserves like gold behind it. But that's also the reason why I think it's going to take a very major shift in power, political and financial power, to have gold really have the kind of future, because these bankers are going to be fighting tooth and nail. These institutions, these relationships that they have with leadership in Washington, with the Federal Reserve, with all a tremendous amount of might has gone into not having gold-backed speculative transactions and expansions throughout the world. And so I think it's going to be a very uphill battle for it to make a comeback. As an actual requirement to back speculation, I think that's going to be a very, very long haul, if it's possible at all, given the opposition from a very strong, concentrated, powerful political financial alliance in the U.S.
Yep. One thing that sustained the US dollar after the early 1970s was the fact that oil was only sold in US dollars. How did the petrodollar change in the 1970s the relationship between Wall Street and Washington?
That's an excellent question, because the history that I trace back from the early 1900s through the 70s is a history of very close relationships and family ties and societal associations and bankers and Wall Street and leaders in Washington being primarily on the same page, give or take a few crises. But by the time the bankers discovered that they could be involved in recycling petrodollars, the money that was made in dollars off of the profits of oil in the Middle East, they started to fragment from having to even pretend to be aligned with for example, U.S. policies that help the national population at home or the public interest in the U.S. or globally, because all of a sudden they have this outside source of tremendous profitability and capital that they then recycled into debt into the Latin American countries where they had wanted to expand, but now they have this additional capital to do it with. And they started to really come away from the idea of aligning with the government, even though they still push the government, and they continue to do that today, and there's still relationships, and there's still meetings, and there's still family ties, all those things still exist, but they have this outside source of power through the capital that was provided to them by petrodollars. And since that time, the accountability and the recklessness, the accountability has declined and the recklessness has increased in the most powerful firms and bankers on Wall Street.
Yeah, one illustration might be the following. In your book, you're writing about the revolution in Iran in 1979 and how that was caused in part by very selfish action undertaken by David Rockefeller. Could you tell us about this, please?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time at at all of the libraries of the presidents in my book, but at Jimmy Carter's archives, which are in Atlanta, Georgia in the U.S., and they have a system called the RAC system, which has a lot of the files, particularly the national security files that have recently been unveiled. And through tracing those, it was evident that there was a lot of tension in Washington over the relationship that David Rockefeller had had with the Shah of Iran before the Iran crisis, the Iran hostage crisis, but also during the time after that, where Chase unilaterally chose to do something very ballsy, which was at the bequest of David Rockefeller, which was to not accept a payment from the Central Bank of Iran that had come into a syndicate of lenders, including European lenders as well as U.S. lenders that were run by Chase. And by not accepting that interest payment, they basically then declared the bank in default. And by declaring the bank in default, and this was the first default that would have, that had occurred, it really heightened the tensions over what was happening with the hostage crisis and in general relationships between the U.S. and Iran. And even at the end of the hostage crisis, the agreement to release the hostages came down to receiving a lot of the monies back that had been sequestered by Chase and other banks. And there was, even in the last moments before the release of the hostages, which happened under Ronald Reagan's administration and not Carter's, because of just the timing of how it all worked out, there was a lot of activity from the banks about changing numbers and not trusting numbers on one side from the U.S. relative to Iran and so forth. It's a very intricate story, but basically it does show that a lot of David Rockefeller's relationship with the Shah was part of why the hostage crisis even happened, and the fact that it went for so long, and particularly the negotiations at the very end that resulted in the final release of the hostages came down to money, and even in that negotiations there were problems that were caused by Chase and other banks that delayed the entire thing.
Let's go fast forward. Do you see the U.S. financial power on the globe in decline?
I don't, because, and this is different from what a lot of my contemporaries are saying, but because of this power alliance, because of the tightness and the historical connections between the White House and the most powerful players and institutions and legacies on Wall Street, there is so much at stake. And there are so much subsidies that continue to be thrown, epic subsidies, at keeping the financial system as it is, because it reinforces the power of the Washington government and vice versa, which is why the government allows these major bankers and institutions to get away with what they do and to have them subsidized as to the extent that they are, that it creates this very powerful, even though it's artificial, these banks are being propped up by subsidies and not by their own inherent profitability, and that's a very dangerous position that they are in, that they make all of us in because of that. But it's still very powerful. The Fed has $4.2 trillion of securities on its books. This is an epic level of bond purchasing, and is the fact that we have zero interest rate policy for more years now in the wake of the 2008 crisis and ever before is just another indication of how much might, how much power, how many dumb but real decisions are being made in Washington to maintain this power and alliance that I don't think there's any other nation in the world right now who has such a strong and historic connection between its politics and its banking system. And that's why the U.S. continues to do what it does and make these decisions and allow impunity for these individuals, because it is about a power game. And I think as long as they continue to throw so much subsidization and so little accountability at the banking system, it's a way of maintaining power. It's a bad way of maintaining power, but I think that's what we're seeing right now.
One spontaneous question: do you think the intelligence agencies of the US are also involved in this, in sustaining the financial system in the US?
It's not really something I researched in my book, so I mean it's really a whole other can of worms. But certainly the level of intelligence systems that the U.S. has and that others have written about is sufficient to be involved in, being the glue between, from a technology perspective, the glue between finance and government. And the policies of national security in general have been aligned with the policies of expansion of where banks went over decades. So there's been a very tight connection. And as I mentioned before, even in the 70s, the question we were talking about before, it was national security records that I was looking at, not treasury records that I was looking at to figure out what had really gone on during the Iran hostage crisis. So I'm sure as the years go on, we'll see a lot of redacted documents, I'm sure, but there will be existence documents that will show, I think, a strong alignment also of the national security interests and groups and entities in Washington with the political and financial heads as well of this equation.
What do you see as the end game of the ongoing financial crisis, and how can people prepare for it?
That is also an excellent question. We continue to, the end game is the game that we're in now for the financial players, which is that they have, in the wake of the crisis, been ridiculously subsidized by governments, predominantly in the U.S., as we've been talking about, but also in Europe. Also, the ECB has done some record epic types of decisions to maintain the largest banks in Europe and their status and to help them. And so I see this continuing, and the result of that is more concentration and consolidation at the hands of the biggest banks and the biggest bank leaders than we've ever had before. In the U.S., for example, the big six banks today have more assets, more deposits, control more derivatives than at any other time in U.S. history. That such a small group of individuals and institutions control so much capital, and implicitly those connections to the political elite as well. So this game continues, this concentration of power and capital continues. Where that goes, I mean, it has so far continued to go in the wrong direction with respect to being a stabilizing situation for individuals. So how do we protect ourselves? We can not keep money in the largest banks, or at least we can minimize the money that we keep in the largest banks. If we even have mortgages in those banks, we can try and still minimize the other amounts of capital that we put in there, because that's a way to at least be outside of the system a little bit. And I think that's important. And I think we have to realize that the euphoria of this supposed recovery that we've been hearing about since 2009 is really a manufactured recovery on the back of 0% interest rates, an epic bond buying program, and all the other things that are going on behind the scenes between political leaders and bank leaders that maintain the appearance of health, but are really a manipulated appearance.
One final question. Why did you give up your career in banking, Nomi?
I was done with it.
Yeah.
I was done with it in 2002. That was actually before that, in 2001. It was a combination of the Enron scandals, WorldCom, 9/11. I had been in banking for a while, and I had seen a lot of things change in the time that I had been there, which fueled my own disillusionment. With the types of people that were rising in the institutions, with the level of secrecy, the level of just sheer, not just greed, but this denial of communication or transparency to customers or clients or investors of what kinds of transactions were being created and what the downsides of those transactions were. I mean, when I first started on Wall Street, it was very important for us to show clients what the downside of a particular trade would be. You know, if you buy this, if you sell this, if you do this combination, this could happen in an adverse scenario. It was just part of what we did, and that became something that there was less and less interest in the banking system. The credit derivatives market, of course, was blowing up at the time that I was leaving the industry. I warned about what would happen when I became a writer. My very first book, Other People's Money, that came out in 2004, about what would happen in the wake of the Glass-Steagall repeal if we didn't get Glass-Steagall back, if we continued on the path of credit derivatives and CDOs that we were going, that it was going to create a large crisis, and it did. And I still believe that. So I think that what I do now, or what I try to do, is alert people as to what's happening now from the experiences that I gained while I was there. And I think the disillusionment that I had as I was leaving is something that I've kept, and I think I've been proven right on publicly as well. And I have a much better life as a writer than I did as a banker, because I'm much clearer with my own conscience as well.
Thank you for your efforts, and thank you for this interview.
Thank you so much, Les.
Thank you.